The war rages on. We have dealt the enemy many crushing blows. We have exposed their positions and driven them back. But they have endured. They have adapted. And they are not as weak as we once thought.
There's your advanced preview. The newest Medal of Honor is out this week, and as you just saw, it's set in modern-day Afghanistan. The controversy? Well, as a player, you can choose to play on the opposing force, essentially as the Taliban. The game's banned at U.S. Army-based stores. To discuss it and more, we're joined by two video gamer experts, Kieran Gillen, director of Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and Lucas Schiesel, site editor of Newsarama. He's also a vet of Operation Iraqi Freedom. All right, let's start with you, Lucas. The controversy. First, you actually could play somebody called Taliban, and the game makers had to change it?
Yeah, initially they actually decided to choose the name Taliban and use that name since it is set in modern-day Afghanistan. This is only during the multiplayer portion, so this is when you're playing online with up to 16 other people and you're playing 8 versus 8. 8 people have to be on the other side. So in previous games, they've had them called opposing forces. They've had them called soldiers versus terrorists. They've never used the proper name like that before. So using that proper name set off some warning flags and made some people pretty upset.
Kieran, just basically, what do you think was what got people so upset and excited? I mean, we have at this point a member of Congress, a guy who wants to be a member of Congress, running against Marcy Kaptur in Ohio, dressing up as a Nazi and saying he does war, reconstructions. Why did this get people so upset?
I mean, the difference is 60 years, really. If blood's actually still on the floor now, it becomes a different matter of taste. As such, it is understandable why you might get offended in that way.
Was this sort of thing as hot in the UK, where you're from?
It's still the sort of thing that makes people, it's been in all the newspapers, people have discussed it as such. I mean, it's interesting because the other ways that people have done this in the past is that there have been examples where both sides play the Americans and they see the other side, as whoever they happen to be fighting, which is, if you want a critique of war games, you've got it right there. But yeah, that's certainly one solution to it.
Heaven forbid they come up with a game, Friendly Fire. Let's not go there. But this is just an example of the kind of criticism that was aired on Fox News with a Gold Star mom, Karen Meredith.
My son didn't get to start over when he was killed. His life was over, and I have to deal with that every day. There's 1,200 families from Afghanistan that have to deal with this every day, and we live it. It's not a game. It is just not a game.
I mean, you can hear her. It's not a game. I mean, that resonates, Lucas. What do you say to people who are trying to make this stuff, make sense of this stuff, and their kids are playing these games?
I of course understand that. It's there. You're talking about every war video game, any video game where there's any violence ever. You can't pinpoint this one game as being some new example compared to everything else that's out there. Yeah. It is a game. This is a game. I've said this before, but the problem here is giving something like a video game the kind of weight and saying that this is inherently a bad thing. I feel like that is the real problem. It can't be the inside the game itself. And you do want someone to say it's not the game that's the problem, it's the actual sending guys to war that's the problem. I'm hoping someone's been saying that. But Kieran, you've looked at the use of video games in military training. This stuff is being used to train people. Do you think it has an effect on how they act on the ground?
They can, but games are fundamentally simulations, and a game like Medal of Honor isn't really simulating war. It's simulating a very cinematic idea of, really, Afghanistan or any war they've previously used is fundamentally material, and then they're looking at a way to present it through a genre. And there are other games, the simulators, are much more punishing. The idea of the amount of time you spend waiting, the sort of skills they're trying to actually teach you are very different. And there's all sorts of lines between a Medal of Honor and a proper simulator. There's the company, one of the companies who do make the American simulators, Bohemia, who are a Czech company. They make a very, very serious soldier-based, ground-based game, which a lot of the time is you spend a lot of sitting around and you talk to people, and it's not flashy. Instead of, like, as you've seen from those shots, it's very close. You see the action. Right. This is much a game played more on the military scale. The idea that there's someone a long way over there.
And does it sell?
Yeah, it sells. It has an audience.
Now, what about the fact that when we watched that WikiLeaks footage of the droneless, the pilotless drone attacks, you were listening to people talking as if they were playing a game. And the other part of the story, it seems to me, is that you've got war looking more and more like a video game, with some of the operators of those drones essentially sitting there with a joystick in Nevada somewhere, nowhere near the battle. The closeness of the experience, surely, that distance between reality and a game gets smaller and smaller.
But like Kieran just said, Medal of Honor is not a simulator, and it's not in any way. It's funny, EA initially, when they started marketing this new Medal of Honor, they were marketing it based on the idea of realism, and they were really pushing that. As soon as this whole Taliban controversy came, that entire marketing campaign was dropped. But it's funny, my first time sitting down with the game with a couple of the developers, and I played it for a while, they were hyping up the realism, this is the Army experience and blah, blah, blah. And they had a squad of 4 what they call Tier 1 operators. And these 4 Tier 1 operators who are supposed to be the best of the best and are supposed to go in and do surgical strikes. And during the course of the mission, they're sitting there shouting to each other and throwing things to each other to pass around ammunition. That's not what happens.
As somebody who was in the military yourself.
Right. These guys would literally not speak an entire word to each other during that entire mission. So that's one tiny example. There are a million more in any one of these games. These aren't death simulators. These aren't even really war simulators in any way. Like you said, it's a Hollywood presentation. And that's what video games are now. They are a Hollywood presentation. They have Hollywood-sized budgets. They make sometimes 5-10 times the amount that Hollywood movies do. And it's interesting how we, as a public, can't seem to switch our minds to be thinking of it that way.
How big is this whole field, Kieran? How many people are out there playing video games?
It's also, the question is like, how do we define video games? And what we're generally talking about in these shows, these incredibly high budgets, high production games that sell for $50, and 10, 15, 17. How many did the Call of Duty do in the first week?
Gosh, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, last year's big hit it hit $330 million of sales in the first 5 days, I believe it was. It wound up beating The Dark Knight's entire box office run in 30 days.
So this is a huge part of our culture. What else is happening?
It's also worth noting that I think this is the thing, when we quote those big numbers around, they also go for $50 a shot.
Yeah.
So whilst this is a smaller group of people paying more, and of course there's many other sorts of games. I mean, that's a very big budget, but I think most people have played some manner of Facebook game now, and that the way that gaming is changing and redefining into these much smaller ways. I mean, I think the most interesting thing about Medal of Honor is despite its setting, despite where it is and quite how temporary it is, how apolitical it is. It's very much bleached of any meaning other than the fact this is a conflict for a video game. And the people who actually do try to engage with the politics, if you're doing it in the mainstream, you're basically doing it through metaphors. You're throwing it through some manner of fantasy, which gives a little bit of distance. Or you're doing it in the indie field, and you're essentially doing it for a much, much smaller budget. And you're making the politics very, very clear and plain, which I find, which is about the entire size of the field.
Yeah.
I think we get the idea of what video games are, and I think it is very much what we, I think the idea is just these explosive, enormous games. This is just a very small part of what video games is now.
I mean, we've talked to people who've talked about how the video games they're involved in making are to try to give people an experience that they couldn't have themselves. And there was another one like that the other day that caused a lot of ruckus. It was Hey Baby. Take a look at this clip from a video game that purports to give people a sense of how frustrating it is to be a woman being hassled constantly on the street.
I know you want it. God bless you.
The point being that you don't typically have a gun blow people away, but the frustration was you wrote a review of this game.
I wrote extensively about it because it is fundamentally a joke. That's the kind of it's a very harsh and black humour, and if you've been hassled this much, maybe occasionally somebody does feel like blowing someone away. And I find that most interesting is men aren't necessarily aware that it goes on if they don't do it. It's like, oh my God, this actually happens, and this frustration is real. And the game, despite being crude, and it's deliberately crude, it's done fast, it's a short game that's meant to get its message across quite quickly. There's subtleties to it. It's not all men actually hit on you, so it's not actually trying to paint all men as fundamentally evil. And it's about the context. The idea of what you may view as actually a quite acceptable compliment is used in the context of, like, 5 metres down the road, another guy has been incredibly crude to you, and you just see, all you see is the pattern.
Our own Sarah Jaffe made the point that no matter how many people the woman seems to blow away, it doesn't stop the guys at all.
Yes, exactly. It's a game about male privilege fundamentally, and it makes the point really well by, as I mentioned earlier, simulations. That's kind of what games do. They create a worldview, they create the rules, and thus the message kind of emerges from it. Or the lack of message if you've decided to make a game. That's the thing about games, is that the message is kind of through the interactions, how the game works. And setting is kind of separate from that almost.
Well, I hope that we can keep in touch with you and hear more about some of the games that are out there and that are interesting, worth talking about, not just the war ones.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in, both of you. There's much more information at our website, GRITtv.org, and tell us what you think. We'd love to hear. Write to us. Thanks.